Hello. We're back with another Why They Hate the USA, going through why various countries dislike American foreign policy and government as a direct result of American actions in and around said countries. This hatred very rarely extends to regular American people, or likewise victims of the same oppressive structures in other ways, despite at times being beneficiaries of the carnage and interventions the US carries out globally. Today's country is Vietnam. Vietnam's beginnings are humble. From ancient times up to the Mongol invasions and beyond, Vietnam has had a long history of dealing with oppression and domination. In 1858, France transformed Vietnam into a semi-feudal resource extraction colony, exploiting rubber plantations and coal mines through forced labor. The Nguyen dynasty had not modernized, which left them vulnerable to French imperialism and their suppression of the True Nom script, which raised centuries of literature, despite it being of little access to regular Vietnamese people. During this time, intellectuals like Pham Bo Chau fused the ethics of Confucianism with anti-colonial theory, which was an important step forward in developing anti-imperialist Vietnamese nationalist ideology, but the change they needed required organized resistance, which this theory lacked. Enter the Communist Party of Vietnam. Founded in 1930, the party brought that badly needed organized resistance with the theoretical basis of Marxism. The party organized peasants and intellectuals alike under a common revolutionary banner. In 1945, the Ho Chi Minh-led Communist Party declared Vietnamese independence from the French, and France mustered what military power it had left to crush the independence movement. While France's war against Vietnam used French troops, 80% of the war's funding came from the US. I've detailed French crimes in Vietnam thoroughly before, here if you're interested. In August of 1964, President Lyndon Johnson and Secretary of State Robert McNamara falsely accused Vietnam of an unprovoked attack on the USS Maddox, which was illegally conducting espionage in Vietnamese waters during covert CIA assaults on their coast in the Gulf of Tonkin. Despite evidence showing the alleged torpedo strike was fabricated, officials exploited this lie to push the Tonkin Resolution, which sidestepped Congress's constitutional role to declare war. Additionally, based on this lie, lawmakers were in near unanimous support for the military intervention and the Supreme Court refused to intervene. As a result, the White House secured unchecked authority to escalate imperial violence framed as defense of national security. It wouldn't be the last time a US administration would use similar tactics to wage war. Anyways, in 1975, the US and Vietnam finalized a peace agreement and reunified the country under the control of the Communist Party after over 30 years of struggle. Of course, post-war Vietnam faced a reconstruction job nearly unmatched in human history. The Doi Moi reforms in 1986 introduced changes which transformed the country from a food importer to the world's second-largest rice exporter, while GDP per capita grew from $700 in 1986 to $4,500 by 2023, as poverty rates plummeted from 14% to under 4%. These numbers definitely make it sound like the market reforms were all positives, which they weren't. We're gonna get back to that in just a second. Back to the video in just a second. Let's thank today's sponsor, Black Forest Supplements. You ever stumble on something that makes you rethink your daily routine? Well, cocoa flavanols can be just that. Now normally chocolate isn't the healthiest option, but we're not talking chocolate here. Flavanols are natural compounds found in cocoa that can do some seriously good work in your body, supporting heart health and even helping with brain function. Backed by science. Dr. William Lee, a Harvard doctor, talks about this in this clip.
Well, clinical studies have been done with high flavanol cocoa to show that in men who are in their 60s with heart disease, they could actually have 2 cups of dark chocolate hot cocoa a day for a month. Yeah. And they doubled the amount of stem cells in their bloodstream and their circulation improved measurably. And then what's even more important and impressive is that there was a study called the Cosmos study that was completed recently that showed that eating high flavanol cocoa decreases the risk of cardiovascular death. Right, over a period of time. Like a statin. Right. Exactly. Except maybe by eating the same thing that you use to make chocolate. So we're not telling people to go out to have chocolate, which is a confection. There's got a lot of sugar and all kinds of other stuff in it. But it's the stuff underlying it, the core of it.
But here's the catch. Most of the cocoa products we get, like candy bars, are processed to the point where all the good stuff is wiped out. That's where Black Forest Supplements comes in. They've developed a high flavanol cocoa powder that keeps those benefits intact. It's just 20 calories per serving, and it tastes great. Throw it in your morning coffee or blend it into a shake and you can easily make it part of your routine. And there's more. Some early research suggests it can support your body's natural stem cell activity. No sketchy treatments, no expensive clinics, just solid nutrition. Sharper focus, better energy. Black Forest is providing 40% off for the next 48 hours for this product. But the stuff moves fast, so be sure to hop on. Go and click my link in the description or use my code HAKIM for 40% off over the next 48 hours. Thanks to Black Forest Supplements for the sponsorship. It allows me to pay my editor fairly, which is much appreciated. Alright, back to the video. Alright, now with the preliminary context out of the way, let's detail the resistance war against America, which America and the West collectively called the Vietnam War. It was said to be waged to stop the spread of an idea, communism. That's an incomplete answer, though. It was also fought for American companies like Chase Manhattan and Caltex Oil, looking to extract resources on the cheap, just like France. From the moment the French sought to reclaim Vietnam as a colony in 1945, and learning nothing from being occupied by the Nazis, the US was eager to help both financially and logistically. By 1950, Washington was bankrolling 80% of France's war costs, shipping machine guns, bazookas, and aircraft from bases in Japan to prevent Vietnamese independence. Americans were still oblivious to what their government was doing during the time, given that this knowledge was revealed much later with the release of the Pentagon Papers. US support began with President Truman's endorsement of French reoccupation of Vietnam. French forces, armed with US weapons, launched brutal mopping-up campaigns, boasting of quelling rebel bands in Vietnam. Meanwhile, they are privately lamenting relentless guerrilla attacks. These are people fighting for their independence, after all. When France's colonial project collapsed at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, negotiations began. The Geneva Accords, not to be confused with the Geneva Conventions, promised nationwide elections and partitioned Vietnam at the 17th parallel, the Communist North supported by the Vietnamese people, and a US puppet regime in the South. The peace talks showed promise, but the US sabotaged this peace process because they knew the Communists would likely win an election, or in any elections for that matter, due to, in part, the overwhelming popularity of Ho Chi Minh. Instead, they installed a dictator named Ngo Dinh Diem, whose 1955 referendum delivered a farcical 98% victory, a figure so absurd that US advisors urged him to aim for a more believable 60%. What wonderful Democrats these Americans are. Diem's regime then reversed land reforms, evicted peasants who'd gained autonomy under the Viet Minh, and branded any resistance as rebel activity to justify violent crackdowns. So much for spreading freedom and democracy and self-determination, of course. Simultaneously, the US escalated its support for their puppet regime, deploying advisors, funding, and eventually troops. Lots and lots of troops. Peak deployment was around over 500,000 people in 1969, with a total deployment reaching over 3 million. And yet, despite all these actions, the US objective in Vietnam wouldn't be outlined until 1961, 16 years after deciding to help French colonial aims. In a National Security Council memo which stated the means by which the war would prevent communist domination, through constructing a viable and increasingly democratic society in South Vietnam, a society where communists weren't allowed to run in elections. This rhetoric ignored their own analysis in the very same memo. It warned that regional turmoil created the ideal environment for communist expansion. Who would have thunk? Framing Vietnam as the linchpin in a wider communist conspiracy to dominate Southeast Asia. Why you would seek power with and through the powerless is never explained, to paraphrase Parenti. To the American foreign policy mind, any attempt to seek independence or threaten profits for American businesses is a conspiracy, seemingly. Anyways, neutral Laos was deemed vital to the North Vietnamese army by the US military, sealing its fate. The US was terrified of the possibility that, if the mountain passes fell to the communists, they'd flank Saigon, the capital, and overwhelm its defenses, transforming the Ho Chi Minh Trail into an invasion route of South Vietnam. While outside the scope of this video, this explains the US rationale for bombing Laos into dust. If you're interested of all the many places the United States has bombed, check out this video here. In an attempt to consolidate power, CIA operative Edward Lansdale orchestrated a forced mass displacement of 1.2 million Catholics from north to south, deploying psychological warfare tactics like spreading ridiculous rumors that Christ has gone to the south and that the Virgin Mary has departed from the north. The US would then systemize this ethnic cleansing with the Strategic Hamlet Program, which was a US scheme to forcibly relocate millions into militarized camps, seizing ancestral lands for corporate access while declaring rural areas free fire zones for indiscriminate bombing and shooting. Not too far from what the Israelis are doing in Palestine. The US free fire zones, according to the military, were placed where civilian presence constitutes voluntary assumption of risk. A Pentagon study later admitted to the program's catastrophic failure. Coercive implementation drove peasants into closer cooperation with the NLF, the National Liberation Front, which was also known as the Viet Minh, or derogatorily the Viet Cong. Diem's authoritarianism ignited an uprising in 1963, known as the Buddhist Crisis. On May 8th, his forces massacred 8 protesters in Hue for defying a ban on Buddhist flags during celebrations of Buddha's birthday. Diem's favoritism towards Catholics in Vietnam, and discrimination against Buddhists in general, was well known. He himself came from a prominent Catholic family. When monk Thich Quang Duc famously self-immolated in Saigon on June 11th, global outrage forced a temporary truce, but even that didn't stop him. By August 20th, Diem raided pagodas across South Vietnam, arresting hundreds under martial law and fabricated claims of Viet Cong weapons to justify his maniacal repression. This was that era's command and control center's justification. The US was initially silent, but soon after the uprising they deemed Diem a liability and had him killed. Isn't it lovely being a friend of the Americans? After Diem's assassination, Time magazine exposed the coup's approval by Dean Rusk, Robert McNamara, and Edward R. Murrow, which revealed to the public that the US was engaging in naked regime change, as they often do. Corporate profiteering exploded as the war dragged on. Agent Orange, a herbicide produced by Dow Chemical and Monsanto, was used by the US military to poison at least 3.6 million acres in order to devastate food supplies and displace communities, a genocidal war crime. Between 1961 and 1971, 90 million gallons of herbicides, including 12 million gallons of dioxin-laced Agent Orange, was sprayed, contaminating soil and water with TCDD, a toxin that causes stillbirths and severe birth defects to this day. Vietnamese studies found parental exposure tripled the risk for spina bifida, for example, and limb deformities, yet the US acknowledged only one birth defect for veterans, ignoring millions of Vietnamese victims. Bombing campaigns obliterated schools, bridges, and hospitals under the guise of denying terrain to the enemy. Pilots in free fire zones dropped napalm with chilling indifference. "We just tossed the bombs out and didn't much care who died," said one Air Force officer, recounting a strike that killed a water buffalo and a child. And while this incident is horrific, it pales in comparison to the cruelty demonstrated during Operation Speedy Express, an operation which epitomizes the systemic slaughter that this war is infamous for. During this operation, the 9th Infantry Division reported 11,000 enemy kills in 6 months, but recovered only a few hundred weapons, essentially making it clear that thousands of civilians were the actual victims. Not to be outdone, the 4th Corps recorded 13,000 civilians wounded in only 6 months. In Ben Tre province, at a hospital that treated civilians wounded by US weapons, survivors described helicopters gunning down anyone, even the water buffalo. An internal probe would concede civilian deaths were a constant accepted result of command priorities valuing body counts over accuracy, noting non-combatants were likely the majority killed. Statistical analysis shows Operation Speedy Express may have killed over 7,000 Vietnamese civilians in just one operation. The United States dropped 5 million tons of bombs on Vietnam, around twice the total the Allies dropped in World War II, and the equivalent of dropping both nukes on Japan 139 times. Given all the bombing and chemical warfare, the human toll is tremendous, as you may expect. A good read of the psychopathic approach of the Americans is Kill Anything That Moves, The Real American War in Vietnam by Nick Turse. It's a sobering read, to say the least. By 1973, the war had killed 3 million people, with the vast majority being civilians, including 500,000 children. Over 14 million people were displaced, and 800,000 children became orphans. Why are these numbers so high? Well, a major reason why comes from My Lai. There, soldiers were ordered to kill everything that breathes. This resulted in US soldiers massacring 500 unarmed villagers, including infants torn from their mothers' arms and executed at point-blank range. General William Westmoreland praised such aggressiveness, lauding units for inflicting heavy blows despite the dead being civilians. The Pentagon dismissed survivors' accounts as exaggerated and tried to scapegoat low-ranking officials or officers while running cover for policymakers. A 1971 memo deemed civilian deaths acceptable collateral damage for population control, excusing their atrocities as inevitable because they were denying terrain to the enemy forces. Fast forward to today, and Vietnam's landscape is still affected. 26 million bomb craters pockmark the south, which become stagnant pools that breed malaria in the summers, and over 500,000 acres of farmland remain a literal minefield of unexploded ordnance. Between 1962 and 1971, 20 million gallons of Agent Orange were sprayed over an area the size of Massachusetts, as the dioxin, which lingered in soil until 2001, persists in sediment, in water, food chains, and breast milk, causing birth defects and neurodevelopmental disorders in children to this day. At Da Nang's former US Air Base, dioxin levels in the soil remain 300 to 400 times above safe limits, threatening 100,000 residents. Cleanup efforts, such as the $300 million project that superheated 90,000 cubic meters of soil to 335 degrees Celsius in Da Nang, Ben Hoi, and Pho Cat, only offered temporary containment. The Vietnamese Red Cross estimates 3 million victims of such exposure, yet the US continues to deny their responsibility, often attributing it to malnutrition only. The war's architects, generals, CEOs, politicians, have never faced justice. The United States committed acts of genocide and ethnic cleansing in Vietnam, nearly unparalleled in history, and they must be recognized as such. The War Remnants Museum in Ho Chi Minh City offers a visceral counter-narrative to American exceptionalism. With 500,000 annual visitors, 2/3 of them foreign, its graphic exhibits, Agent Orange deformities, napalm burns, photos of American soldiers posing with severed heads, forces a reckoning with the war's cost and US barbarism. It's just a shame that the entire US population can't be exposed to the crimes of their government and military. The 1964 US embargo against North Vietnam, codified under the Trading with the Enemy Act, criminalized all commercial transactions, direct or indirect, between US entities, citizens, corporations, subsidiaries, and Vietnam, with violations punishable by 12-year prison terms and $500,000 in corporate fines. This means you can't do any business with Vietnam, in essence. This includes blocking products containing just 10% US manufactured components as well, effectively barring Vietnam from accessing critical machinery and oil. Following the Paris Peace Accords, which began in 1973 and ended in 1975, the US expanded the embargo to the newly unified country. They froze $200 million in South Vietnamese assets and vetoed World Bank and IMF loans, which stalled infrastructure projects like the highway upgrades and port expansions that were deeply needed. These measures were justified as a way to coerce Vietnam into, among other things, giving the US what it wanted in Cambodian peace negotiations. The embargo had ripple effects on global trade. US oil firms lost offshore drilling rights to European rivals who were more open-minded in accessing Vietnamese markets, while Japanese companies delayed investment until 1992, when Tokyo defied Washington by giving Hanoi $380 million in loans. Then, Taiwanese firms swooped in to exploit the vacuum, securing 20% of Vietnam's foreign investment by 1992 via small-scale businesses in textiles and electronics. Meanwhile, the US Treasury cracked down on dollar transactions in 1991, which further strained Vietnam's ability to trade, which forced them to rely on barter deals and blocked accounts. If I remember correctly, even Americans who, through some measure, were able to visit Vietnam weren't allowed to spend more than $100 a day or something in the country. Just ridiculous levels of economic embargo and sanctioning. As we mentioned before, this embargo was part of an 80-year arc of coercion against Vietnam. Despite wide attempts to create new inroads, many of which were successful by Vietnam, this embargo drove Hanoi to rely almost solely on Moscow. This aid decreased and eventually vanished after the illegal dissolution of the USSR, prolonging the isolation created by US economic warfare. I talked earlier about the effects of Agent Orange, but one thing I left out was that it further undermined productivity, which deepened post-war economic strain. Agricultural output plunged without fertilizers or modern machinery, which were blocked by the embargo, forcing reliance on outdated methods of agriculture. When the 6th Party Congress convened at the end of 1986, inflation reached an insane 700%. And exports of $500 million barely covered half of the $1.2 billion in imports. To make things even worse, the US also froze $350 million in Vietnamese assets until 1995, exacerbating hyperinflation and stalling reconstruction. Because of this, Vietnam took the drastic decision of starting the Doi Moi reforms from 1986 to 1994. Similar to Deng Xiaoping's opening up policy, this policy reintroduced markets on a larger scale and invited foreign investment, which resulted in a doubling of trade by 1993 and $11 billion in investment by 1994, all without US technology or market access. Vietnam managed to build what they referred to as a socialist-oriented market economy, deeply integrated into regional and global chains, with economic diplomacy prioritized to boost exports and attract quality investment. In 1994, the embargo was lifted. The damage done to the economy was almost incalculable. Vietnam's economy ended up structurally dependent on low-risk, foreign-led tourism and light industry. The US delayed normalizing relations due to a lack of progress on prisoner of war or missing in action resolutions, and political reforms tailored by Washington, all while denying multilateral loans and most favored nation status. This set the tone for foreign firms to take advantage of Vietnam's new openness. Now, Vietnam's so-called economic miracle leans heavily on precarious foreign investment. Samsung's giant Bac Ninh complex alone accounts for 30% of electronic exports, leaving the economy vulnerable to corporate whims. Infrastructure projects like the Haiphong port, bankrolled by $11 billion in foreign investment, are similar to certain colonial-era export corridors at the expense of the environment. Meanwhile, transfer pricing and fake losses but real profits schemes stealthily drained state coffers already worn thin by other economic crises. Textile workers, once under collectivized systems, now faced low-wage, insecure contracts in these same export-oriented factories. This labor exploitation looking not too different from previous examples of it within Vietnam. Other major companies, particularly Samsung, and various subsidiaries, failed to pay their fair share in taxes. And there's various examples to it, but I don't want to dwell on it too much. The point I want to come to is that the Vietnamese government isn't stupid, and has developed creative methods of getting foreign corporations to pay their taxes, while blunting the sharper edges of the market reforms and ensuring the socioeconomic well-being of their population. The latest anti-Trump tariff measures include a reorientation, seen globally from trade with the global north, and particularly the United States, to the global south, with impressive successes. Post-Doi Moi anti-corruption measures, like the 2018 anti-corruption law, created a framework which outlaws bribery for personal gain in state affairs, mandates strict transparency and disclosure for public companies, banks, and approved NGOs, and requires officials to declare their own, their spouses, and their minor children's assets and income, with authorities empowered to demand verification documents. Under international treaties, Vietnamese authorities can freeze, confiscate, and repatriate assets tainted by cross-border corruption, and state bodies and office holders are barred from accepting gifts tied to their official duties. So what have we learned today? Hopefully it's clear now why the US is hated worldwide, and why the Vietnamese population isn't too fond of the American government. From funding French colonialism to dumping millions of gallons of Agent Orange on large swaths of land, the US treated Vietnam like a laboratory for death. Free fire zones, My Lai massacre, Operation Speedy Express weren't tragic accidents, but part of a deliberate plan to kill as many Vietnamese people as possible, only for standing for their own independence against foreign profits. Post-war sanctions were just another way to continue this war using neoliberal reforms that let corporations exploit workers and seize land, instead of dropping bombs and napalm. The heroic Vietnamese people, however, ever creative and dynamic, find ways of maintaining their sovereignty and socialist system. Through collaboration with BRICS, reorienting trade, and maintaining control over their core industries, Vietnam is another victim of horrific American imperialism, pleasantly emerging into the new, de-dollarized 21st century. The future is bright, and only brighter still in light of the senseless violence of empire the United States still pushes around the world. A better world is possible, one led by countries like Vietnam. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you too.